ironed out because of this poster, and then that helped make me, kind of on track to try to work towards publication, because it kind of forces you to have a deadline. The thing about publications, which you guys shouldn't be worrying about really too much right now, but they oftentimes don't have deadlines, so that's why it's easy for, you always hear faculty saying that they have to write and they should be writing, or grad students, kind of that's like the mantra. But doing a poster or presentation kind of helps keep you, engaged in that research, and it's kind of a baby step towards that. Of course, if you have already published your work, you still can present as well, and that's a good way to, again, disseminate your findings to a broader audience. It also helps to advance your field. So in addition to, that kind of goes along with disseminating your research findings, but the knowledge that you gain and that you have developed as part of your project, can be shared with other people in your field, and that can help move the field forward. That's the purpose of doing some kind of research or scholarly activity. Bless you. Presenting your work also provides you with an opportunity to receive recognition from other people in your field, such as your peers or other colleagues or other faculty or other scholars within your area. It's a great way to build your resume or CV, which is why I say even if it's a small opportunity to present your work, like say the Meeting of the Minds, which might not seem small to some of you, but it's obviously a little bit smaller than going to, say, the national meeting for your specific discipline. But that's still a great way to kind of build your resume and, work on kind of developing comfort and confidence in talking to other people about your work. I think, sometimes students might shy away from doing any kind of presentation, especially when it's elective, like a conference or Meeting of the Minds or something like that, because it can be, it can feel really intimidating and really anxiety-provoking to have to get up there and talk about, your work and, kind of specialized knowledge that you have. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. So it's a good idea to kind of seek out these opportunities, if for nothing else, but for practice. And then the kind of final goal, which is usually what comes to mind, I think, most readily when you think about, why go to a conference. Networking is another really important outcome of presenting your work. So not only do you get to meet people that are interested in your work, so they have common interests, but you also just get to meet other people within your discipline. So a lot of my students, for example, I encourage them to go to different types of conferences depending on kind of their goals and where they are in their academic career. But it's a great time to, especially for one of the conferences that I send my kind of seniors or graduate students to, is a conference that's well attended by researchers from affiliated with doctoral programs. So it's a great way for them to meet mentors. But even a smaller regional conference that some of my my psychology honors students go to, gives them an opportunity to learn about or meet people that go to other master's programs, or it provides them an opportunity to learn about certain scholarships or internship programs. So it's a great way to network and get to meet people and learn about opportunities. Any questions so far? So one last thing about finding a conference. There's a lot of different kinds of conferences. So like I mentioned, there could be ones that are just part of your own institution at home, like Meeting of the Minds. How many times can I say that today? Like Meeting of the Minds here in May. And then there's also, of course, other student conferences. Like, so for example, some of those psychology honor students that I have, they're going to present their work at UCLA's student research competition. They're going to present their research at, I think the University of Redlands also has a research competition that's coming up, I think, this month or so, or next month. So you can find like local, institution conferences just for students. And then, of course, once you get within your discipline, there's regional conferences. So, for example, because I'm psychology, some of my students go to the Western Psychological Association's annual meeting, and that's just schools from the western part of the country. So all the CSUs typically participate, schools from Oregon, schools from Washington, you get the idea, Western. And that's a little bit of a smaller conference. It's very, very like student focused, which is nice. It's usually where I send them to kind of first kind of get their feet wet. And then there's also, of course, national conferences for national organizations like American Psychological Association. And within that, there's a bunch of others. And then, of course, there's also international conferences. So you have a lot of options to choose from. If you're not sure, but you'd like to participate in something like this at some point during your career, talk to your faculty advisor, and they can probably, recommend to you what would be kind of most appropriate based on kind of where you're at, and then also your work and kind of what your goals are. I think sometimes selecting a conference also depends on what you're hoping to achieve. If you're just hoping to present your work, or you're just, for example, like I was mentioning earlier, if you're trying to, say, meet people from particular programs or certain internships, there's might be some conferences that are more attended by individuals from, those groups, so it kind of just depends. If you don't know where to start at all, look on the websites of professional organizations. So, of course, most professional organizations, like American Psychological Society or something like that, they usually have their own conference, but oftentimes they'll have other local or regional conferences that they advertise, especially, for students or trainees. When all else fails, use Google. So you can always put like teaching conference, if you're interested in education or teaching conference Southern California, and kind of see what comes up. Or veterinary medicine, California conference, and see what comes up. Or if you're trying to screen by getting it local, which kind of gets to my next point here. You want to consider kind of your budget. So while we all would like to have the opportunity to present our work in Italy, that's obviously a lot more costly. So I always encourage students to also find a conference that's going to meet kind of their budget. Even for me, the annual meeting that I go that's a national conference, I just went this past year. Where was it? I don't remember. Oh, it was in DC. And my total bill was like $2,200. Doesn't help that their registration fee for professionals. There's always lower fees for students, so that's good. But the professional fee was like $700, so that's like a significant portion. But that's something that you want to investigate beforehand, before you apply to go to a conference, and then you go to register and you're like, oh my God, they don't have a student fee, or this is really meant for professionals, like the one I'm referring to is attended, I think, a lot by practicing psychologists, so they make a lot more than faculty. So I don't know, that's on Oregon. A lot of MDs go too, so I don't know, maybe that's why the fee's so high. But anyway, consider your budget, pay attention to some of the fees. Sometimes, that same conference I was talking about, when I was a grad student, when I went, they used to have, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have opportunities for students to volunteer at the conference, and then they would waive your registration fee if you volunteered, like helping people register or sign in or pick up sign-in and sign-out sheets, that kind of thing. So, there are potentially opportunities like that depending on the conference. And then most importantly, consider proposal submission deadlines. So if you're planning to apply to present your work at a conference, usually you have to submit an abstract or a short summary of your work sometime, obviously, before the conference. And usually, at least in my field, it's typically about 9 months before the actual meeting. And it's so far in advance because obviously they receive a lot of submissions, so somebody has to review those. So they send it to, for example, I just did some reviews today for a conference. So they have to send them to, other, scholars or researchers within the field to kind of evaluate them. Then they have to notify people, and then they have to start building their schedule. Even for Meeting of the Minds, our deadline was extended, but it was extended to the Friday of spring break, and it's not until May 17th. So even for that, it was still a month and a half in advance. And that's because it gives us time to estimate how many people we need to accommodate, and put together a program, and to schedule events and all that. So you want to take that into consideration. Usually, now of course you can always attend some kind of conference or competition and not present, and that's still a great opportunity to just network, get exposed to different people's work, as well as I think a kind of sub-goal or secondary, I guess, outcome of going to conferences or meetings is that in addition to getting to do all the things that, kind of I mentioned on the first slide, like presenting your work, you also get to observe other people present their work and other people talk and network, and sometimes you can learn a lot just through kind of observational learning. So even if you're not quite ready yet, just getting to go can help you kind of see what it's like, know what's, kind of people do and what's kind of expected, and, there's lots of reasons to go, but typically, at least especially for here on this campus, if you're presenting your actual work, it's usually easier to get some kind of financial support. So for example, we provide funding to support students to travel to conferences, and if you're presenting your work, you can get up to $1,000. And I have information on that on the last slide, but I'm sure you all are already well aware from the first talk I did a long time ago, back in the fall. But if you're not presenting your work, we typically can only cover the registration fee. So there's a big kind of difference, and that's some kind of extra incentive, I guess, to present your work so that you can get some financial help so that you can go and travel and do these things. Okay, so I think I mentioned that. Oh, one other thing is, in terms of like if you're proposing to present, to do an oral or poster presentation at a conference or something of that sort, you want to make sure that you obviously have your mentor's approval before doing that. That's something that we like to know about ahead of time, and we like to usually have an opportunity to review your abstract. And that's kind of just a professional courtesy as well, even going forward. Anybody that you include as an author, so like your mentor or other research assistants or other people that are kind of working with you on that specific project, those would all be people that should be included as authors, and if you're submitting something with somebody's name attached to it, they deserve to see it. And it's helpful for you too, because the more people that see it, the more feedback you're going to get, so that there's less errors and things like that. And then usually once you submit, it takes a few months to kind of hear back about whether or not you're approved to present. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk specifically about the two different types of presentations that I mentioned, but any questions about conferences in general, or going to conferences, or finding one? Or... Okay, so generally, most conferences consist of kind of a variety of activities. Some of them can include workshops or trainings, which I'm not going to talk about today, but that's another reason to go to conferences, because sometimes you can gain specialized knowledge or develop skills in a certain area. So for example, some of our psychology students can do like statistics workshops at that regional conference. Or at the national conference that I mentioned that I go to, treatment developers actually have trainings on their specific treatment. So, again, psychology. So, but you get the idea. There's usually some kind of discipline-specific training or workshops that happen at that time. I'm actually going to a new conference in June. It's in Ohio, and it's for undergraduate research. And they have a whole day-long workshop on it's meant to be for new directors of Office of Student Research. So, within that, there's a workshop. And so it's a great time to build skills and kind of get ideas and network with other people. So, okay. So oral presentations are typically brief. I'd say that the average length is about 10 minutes, but it kind of depends, because sometimes you can do an oral presentation as part of like a panel where there's a number of different scholars or researchers that kind of have different projects that kind of center around one theme. And those tend to be a little bit shorter. So each person, describes their work or project for about 10 minutes, and then there's time for questions at the end. Sometimes it can be a paper presentation where you write a paper and then you go give an oral presentation about your paper. Those tend to be a little bit longer, but not significantly so. They're generally pretty brief. I would say somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and then they allow time for questions and answers afterwards. You want to make sure that your oral presentation is kind of you're kind of allowing time to evenly discuss all aspects of your project. So again, especially if you're coming from, a scientific discipline, then you want to make sure that you have time to talk about the introduction, the method, the results, and then the discussion. Generally, what that means if you're from a different discipline, you want to provide background on the topic, kind of hook your audience in, talk about kind of its relevance and importance, what you've done, what you found, or what your conclusions are, and then why is it important? What are the implications of that? Unlike a paper, though, where you might provide a great amount of detail, your oral presentations are really just a summary of your work, as are poster presentations, except I think poster presentations are even briefer. So a lot of times that's the challenge that I encounter with my students is, after you've written a paper, like an honors thesis or something, everything feels so important because you have put all that work and in researching that information and constructing those sentences, and it's hard to cut out things because everything feels important. So as painful as it may be to cut back some of your work for your presentation, you kind of have to do it. And it's an important kind of skill to learn. But you have to really be able to figure out what your kind of main and most important parts of your research is and present just that. Okay, so now I'm going to go through those specific components of the presentation in a little more detail. I'm going to make sure I'm okay. Okay. So for the introduction, that's really just an opportunity for you to provide background information. So sometimes you might describe what other scholars have found. You might present a framework for a theory that maybe guides your work, as well as you want to start off typically right away by highlighting the significance of the research or whatever it is that you're talking about. That's what's going to draw your audience in and get them to actually pay attention to what you're saying, as opposed to, what they are going to eat for lunch or what email they just got or what's happening on Instagram. So make sure that you really highlight the significance. I think sometimes that's also something that I find is sometimes a little bit challenging for students, because you're interested in your work and you find it exciting and you kind of know why it's relevant and important. So we forget sometimes those things that we already know, that other people don't necessarily have that knowledge or interest. So you got to try to, capture, kind of your audience and make sure that you're, getting them engaged and excited about it as well. When putting together your presentation, you want to make sure you know your audience. So again, depending on the conference that you go to, you can be needing to tailor your presentation for different audiences. So for example, if you're going to meetings of the Minds or UCLA Student Research Competition or something like that, that's going to be attended by people from all different disciplines, right? And they're largely, I imagine, attended, at least in the Minds, by students, right? So people that may or may not have advanced, specialized technical knowledge in your field. So you need to make sure that you use appropriate language and describe the information that you're presenting in a way that's going to be accessible to everybody. On the other hand, if you're going to say, one of the national conferences I was describing, so there's one that I go to that's attended largely by psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers that are interested in PTSD and trauma in mental health. That's very specific. So for those individuals, I don't really have to describe what PTSD is. I mean, they would probably be really bored if I started describing kind of the criteria that go along with that diagnosis. So I don't need to, I can kind of get, I still need to provide some background information, but I can be a little more kind of detailed and specific in what I'm talking about. I can go into a little bit more depth, right? As opposed to if I was presenting at Meeting of the Minds and I was trying to kind of make this information accessible to everyone who might just be like, okay, what's trauma? What's PTSD? Why do we even care about this, right? So you need to make sure that you know kind of who's going to be at this conference so you know how to kind of tailor your presentation accordingly. For oral presentations, which is what we're on right now, slides should have simple bullet points which refer to the topic. So one of the kind of biggest things or kind of issues that I see when I review students' slides for an oral presentation is that oftentimes they kind of cut and paste from their paper and they write in full complete sentences with commas and transitions and things like that. It's way too much text. You should have the least amount of text as possible on your slide because you want people listening to you, not necessarily reading off your slide. Don't judge my slides right now because they have a lot of text. Like this right here is like way too much text. Really, you want to keep it brief and short. And if you're going to use citations, to cite your work, you want to put it in a footnote area, not put it up here with what you're saying, because again, that's just going to detract. The eyes are going to go there, and it can be a little overwhelming if, again, there's a lot of text, and then it's all kind of detracts from what you're actually saying. So you want to keep your slides as minimal as possible. It's fine to also incorporate images or videos, things that kind of support what you're saying or kind of help people visualize what you're talking about, but you don't want to have too much text. So after you've kind of discussed kind of your introduction, highlighted the relevance, significance, provided background information, prior research or theory, then the next section usually focuses on kind of the method. So what you've actually done, what you've analyzed, and so again, that's going to vary a little bit depending on your discipline. But you want to make sure that, again, you include as much information as possible and you don't make assumptions about what judges know. So sometimes, like for example, I'm getting ready for the student research competition, the CSU system-wide one. We're sending 10 students, including Sierra, to represent our campus. Sorry. And so, if I embarrassed you. So I'm reviewing a lot of people's slides, and so sometimes I'm working with students that are from disciplines that are very far different than my own. And I don't know, I don't want to call anybody out, but I don't know the methods that they're describing because it's not my background. So they're talking about tools and procedures and things, and I'm just like, what is that? So you don't want to make, again, you want to know your audience and you don't want to make assumptions kind of based on that. So you want to make sure you provide an appropriate level of detail. Even if you, say, are just doing some kind of critical analysis and you've selected sources to pull from, again, if you have a pretty broad audience, you want to describe how you went about that, right? Because people may not know that are outside your discipline. And I already mentioned to include images or videos if relevant. So the next part of the presentation usually focuses on your results or conclusions. Keep in mind that your audience can't necessarily keep track of more than 1 or 2 results or conclusions at a time. So you don't have one slide that has 6 different conclusions or 6 different results with stats and all this other stuff. That's a lot to consume. So you want to keep it, again, do your best to kind of be parsimonious in your explanation, but also when all else fails, at least just put 1 or 2 things per slide so it's a little bit more digestible. If you did statistics, make sure you include statistical information. And you don't want to read necessarily every word of kind of your results out loud. Instead, you really want to point out information. So if you're showing something from a figure or a graph, certainly you want to point to that and highlight that. But you really want to focus on kind of like the main result, what you found. And it's best to use kind of figures or tables than just having a bunch of numbers, for example, if you are using statistics. Because again, it's going to make it kind of more digestible to your audience. The last part of the presentation is kind of the discussion section that gives you an opportunity to kind of restate your main findings or conclusions. You're going to reiterate kind of the significance or importance of your work, what the implications are, discuss any limitations of your research or any, limitations of your work, and then talk about your future directions, like where you want to go next, or what follow-up studies may be necessary, or how you could have improved what you did. Any questions about those components? Okay. So with oral presentations, typically you're using something like PowerPoint. I didn't say that, but I think I implied it. But you want to make sure that all your visual aids look professional, and try to use the largest font that you can, within reason. Again, you want to have the least amount of text as possible, and you want to make sure that people you don't know necessarily in advance what room you're going to be using or how big the screen is going to be, so you want to make sure that people can actually read what's going to be on your slide. I recommend using at least 20-point font for everything that you present. I've already mentioned less is more, so the less content, the better. It's best to use a dark background with a light font. So sometimes I get posters and they're like bright green with like yellow font, or it's like red font. Your eyes just like hurt looking at it. So usually dark background with a light font. It's always nice to incorporate your school colors. So we have that nice blue, which I'm sure has an official name that I'm not familiar with. Anybody know the name of the school's blue? They usually have like official names. I know my grad school's was, prairie gold. It's not yellow, it's prairie gold. It's very specific. But it's always nice to incorporate school colors if you're really stuck. Use the coyote blue, that's what I'm going to call it, and light text. But you want to have good contrast. I already talked about incorporating videos or photos. And your visuals should be attractive, but professionally attractive. So it's okay to include like some images, and you guys probably know what I'm talking about. People, instructors usually incorporate these into slides that they use for their lecture to kind of keep things exciting and fun. But you don't want to overdo it, right? So you want to make sure that it's still tasteful and professionally attractive. With oral presentations, or really any kind of presentation, you of course want to practice, practice, practice. Whether that's in front of your teddy bear, your dog, your mom, the bathroom mirror. Practice as many times as you can, because ultimately that's going to help you feel more confident, and then of course you're going to do a better job as well. You can, of course, I've already talked about the second point, so the third point there, bring notes if necessary. So it's good to, of course, lay out what you're going to say for the presentation, and so usually people make notes or have cue cards or come up with an outline or something of that sort. And that's fine to bring with you in case you get stuck and you forget what you wanted to say. But you want to avoid reading off a note card or notes or slides or anything of that sort. So it's nice to have it in case you get stuck, but you don't want to just, I've seen a number of presentations where people just unfortunately read directly off something. You want to be making eye contact with your audience. Now, usually those are the people that are really anxious and they don't want to make eye contact with the audience because they just don't even want to be up there. But again, think about it as practice. As a psychologist, I'll tell you it's good exposure therapy, good way to kind of get used to your anxiety with public speaking. And again, you're going to look more knowledgeable, you're going to appear more confident, and people are going to be more apt to listen to what you want to say. Because when you're actually talking, you're emphasizing different words, your voice tone is changing, and usually when you're reading, your voice doesn't kind of have the same variations in its inflection as it does when you're actually talking about something. Okay, and then make sure that you also go slow enough and don't forget to breathe, because oftentimes people get up, talk in front of people, and then sometimes they talk very fast. Okay, other tips. If you're referring to something that's on a slide, consider walking to the screen and pointing it out if possible. So it's nice to have a clicker or a laser pointer of some sort, such. When you're practicing, practice if you're going to have a laser pointer or something of that nature, or you're going to be advancing your slides, it's good to actually practice with all of those components so that you're prepared and it's not something that's going to throw you off the day of. Dress professionally, but be comfortable. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then really just relax. So you want to think of your audience as people who are just interested in what you did and what you found, not a group of people who are evaluating you. In most cases, unless it's a competition, you're not formally being evaluated. Sometimes you need to remind yourself of that. It's really just to share your work with other people that find that topic interesting. And of course, be confident, because ultimately you know your project better than anybody else, except maybe a mentor or something of that sort. So don't get too intimidated or anxious and assume that you don't know anything or everybody else in the room is smarter than you, because I promise you that's not the case. You know your work best, and this is your chance to kind of show off your work. Any questions? Yeah?
So from your experience, have you ever actually had any students who were just super timid to like actually go through one of these processes? And if so, what would you do to get that student through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I have worked with a number of students that, you know, I think anxiety is pretty common. We all experience anxiety. I mean, I don't know people that don't have wouldn't have any anxiety, especially if they're presenting their work for the first time or 2 or 3 times. So I think it's normal, but of course it can vary in terms of how significant it is. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, when I have students that have kind of struggled, you know, obviously I've provided them with feedback on things they could do to potentially improve, but then really just practice, I think, is the biggest thing. And so, again, it's not a bad idea, especially if you are a little bit more anxious, you know, in addition to doing those kinds of practice activities like at home or with your mom or with family or friends, those are great too. But, you know, also use your faculty mentor as a resource as well. You know, if you're feeling particularly anxious, you should run it through with them as your audience, or send them your slides. I mean, they probably want to see them anyway. But send them, don't assume that they're too busy or they don't want to see it, especially if their name's on it. But, you know, use them as a resource, or if there's other students that you're working with, you know, you guys all have a captive audience that I'm sure if any of you had to do a presentation, you could easily find people, or somebody's phone is up here.
That's my phone.
It would probably be easy for you guys to find a, you know, a captive audience of people you could practice with, and I think that that's ultimately the best way to kind of get over your fear, because the more times you do it, you know, the less anxiety provoking it really is. So, of course, you know, there's also courses that you could take on public speaking. You know, I think that's usually some kind of GE requirement. So you'll probably do that at some point during your education here.
This quarter.
Oh, this quarter. Okay, so there you go. So you're all getting your practice now. So even though those courses, I'm not going to lie, when I was an undergrad, I didn't take public speaking because I hated public speaking. So I took interpersonal communication, and I ended up getting like a C- or a C, which I was like really upset about, especially because like I knew I was taking it to avoid that, and I felt like it was a weird class, and the professor was weird, and the grade, it was just, anyway. So yeah, interpersonal communication, and then I became a psychologist, so I don't know what that means, but clearly the class had no bearing on anything. But I even avoided public speaking in college because I was that anxious. And really, I'm not anxious now, but I mean, obviously I have a lot of practice And that's really, I think, what helps the most. But there are courses that you can take to help. And that's in part why, you know, your instructors usually have you do presentations in class. Of course, it's to, you know, support the course content and student learning, but it also helps you, you know, kind of develop your oral presentation skills over time that are going to be useful whether you, regardless of kind of what your next step is, you know, whether you're going into the workplace or whether you're going to graduate program, that's a skill you're going to need to have usually to be successful in most fields. Yeah?
Do you find that there's a difference between speaking in front of giant crowds and speaking in front of small crowds? And which one's worse?
I think that's probably a personal thing, to be honest. I think, for me personally, I think a larger crowd at first glance seems more intimidating, but it everyone kind of becomes more, there's like this illusion of anonymity sort of thing, because there's so many people, whereas a small group, everyone's like focusing, you're focusing, just like if I was just talking to this little section here, I'm going to be making eye contact with all of you, and you guys are going to be just looking at me, so I think that that's a little bit more anxiety-provoking. Typically at most conferences it's going to vary, but I would say, you know, in my experience, most of the time when I have done an oral presentation or my students have, there's usually anywhere from like 10 to 25 people in the audience. So it's usually not a huge group like this. This is a little bit more unique, you know, I think, to talk in front of this many people at a conference or something, unless you're like a keynote speaker or you're really famous, and I don't know. Did you want to add anything? Or? Yeah. I think it varies too, like if you know the people. Because for example, like, it doesn't make me anxious to talk to students or to obviously teach class or something of that sort, but if I had to give a presentation in front of like just the other psychology faculty, I think that would make me pretty anxious. Like, you know, I don't know, like a 6 or 7 out of 10 or something. So it all just depends on the person. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to just talk about quickly is poster presentations. So I'm just going to kind of describe what it is, and then I'll show you some examples. And again, these are examples from psychology kind of background. So they kind of follow the scientific method. But poster presentations, so oral presentations, we have a good idea. You're getting up, you're talking in front of people about your work. Poster presentation is a little bit different because you're putting together a poster that basically, you know, kind of describes your work. And you're talking about your research usually, but it's kind of happening in a different context. So typically if you do a poster presentation, which if some of you want to check this out, Meeting of the Minds, you know, we have both kinds of presentations, so you can get a feel for what I'm talking about. But typically with poster presentations, you get sent to a very large room that has lots of different kinds of display boards or bulletin boards set up. You put your poster up there, and then you basically stand next to your poster. Most poster presentations are about an hour, but sometimes they can be up to 2 hours. It just depends on the conference and their schedule. But basically you stand by your poster, and then people come in and they look at your poster and they ask you questions. Or sometimes they just walk right by and you just stand. But this is a great opportunity as well to, you know, showcase your work. And, you know, one of the kind of benefits is, I think it's a good way to get your feet wet if you're not quite ready for an oral presentation. It's much less intimidating. Although there certainly are anxiety-provoking moments when people start asking you questions. But it's definitely, I think, less intimidating than an oral presentation. But you stand by your poster and people come up. Sometimes people just come up and look at your poster and you might say hello and then they might just read it and walk away. Sometimes they might just look to you to describe to them, tell me about your research or tell me about what's on here, and then you obviously want to be able to effectively do that. So even with this, there's some kind of practice involved. You want to know how to describe your project and what you found. Or, like I said, they might just read the poster or listen to you talk about it and then ask you questions. Usually this is a good way to get to talk one-on-one with other scholars. Sometimes also my students use the poster presentations as a good time to stalk or seek out students that are in programs that they want to apply for, to kind of talk to the student about the program and what their experience has been like. So it's also another good way for just kind of various forms of networking. It basically, again, how your poster looks can really vary a lot depending on what you're presenting and what discipline you're in. But it usually has the same kinds of information that's in an oral presentation. It's just on one very large PowerPoint slide that you print off. So I'll show you some examples. These are ones that I did. So here's one. Just to give you an idea, there's kind of the introduction, hypotheses, methods, results, and then kind of conclusions. Usually you always want to have a kind of statement that has your kind of contact information, so people that can come by can get your information if they want to ask you questions. Usually in addition to printing this poster, which is fairly large, usually it's like 3 feet by 4 feet, I think, I'll usually print these as handouts as well, so people can take them with them if they want to go. If they want to, again, like, you know, just have information on your study, or if they want to reach out to you or ask you questions. Mine are going to be all pretty similar, but just different format. So here's another one. It's same sections, pretty much. It was just a little bit of a different layout. And here's another one. So, these ones that are not actually the kind of most exciting. Usually, there might be more figures or graphs or things of that sort, or pictures or images. But hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of what I mean by poster. You probably had to do something similar at some point, at least in high school. So, yeah.
They remind me of like when I'm on the first or third floor of Jack Brown, how they have large research posters on the walls. Yeah, so most of the departments that you visit, and that's a good way if you want to get an idea of kind of what a poster might look like in, psychology versus business or something of that sort. I mean, really, you're just graphically displaying kind of information about your study. But usually you can find examples in department hallways or outside faculty members' offices. Psychology has a number of them up in departments, and then right by our office we have a bunch of ones printed on 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper. And most of them kind of follow this format, but not all of them. So it really just depends. But if you're not sure how to approach it, say it doesn't really follow, you're from a discipline that's, not following kind of the scientific method or has a different approach, ask your mentor. They can probably share examples with you, or when all else fails, Google, and that should give you some ideas. I think these ones that I showed you, they're a little more boring. Just to be honest, I think that, there's lots of different ways to, because your poster also, it's good to kind of be creative when you're doing it while still appropriate, because, sometimes people, what's going to get somebody to come to your poster and talk to you is if, it draws their attention in the first place. And sometimes it might not be just the subject matter, but it might just be, how it looks. So. Last little bits of advice just for going to conferences in general. You shouldn't be presenting the same research at multiple conferences. I guess that some of the ethics behind that might vary depending on your background or discipline, but for example in psychology, you're not supposed to present the same data twice at a psychology conference. Now,
It's different if you're going to a student conference and then you're presenting it again at, a site conference. So for example, a lot of my students are going to present at a regional conference this month, and then next month they're going to use their same poster or same slides at Meeting of the Minds. That's okay because those aren't within the same field. The idea is you're not, just having multiple presentations of the same thing with the same audience. Stay close to your poster during the session. So sometimes students might put up their poster and then walk away or go to the bathroom or just hide so that they don't have to talk about their research. You should stay close to your poster. People, it's usually not that intimidating. Again, I think because it's one-on-one. But it's not like the whole hour you're gonna, if you do spend the whole hour talking to people, then you probably have really, really exciting work. But usually it's kind of just a handful of people that might stop by and ask you questions. Make sure you wear your name tag, so when you register for a conference and when you actually show up, usually you get a badge that has your name and your institution or organization. It's important to wear that so people know who you are. And in this case, if you're going somewhere, it also helps represent the university. Bring handouts, so that's more, I already talked about that for a poster. Also bring backup slides, so if you're doing an oral presentation and you have slides for your presentation, or even if you have a poster, usually people print their posters at home or on campus, and then they kind of take these obnoxious poster tubes that are a pain to lug around with them. But I still say always bring a backup. So, and I think the best way, you might bring your laptop or USB, but USBs get lost, and laptops, sometimes chargers die, or we forget to bring our charger, or there's no outlet. So I would recommend that the most secure, most convenient way is just emailing yourself. It takes 2 seconds. Even if you have to go to Kinko's, all you have to do is log into your email and pull it up. Make sure at the conference you look interested and greet other people. If anybody does ask you a tough question during your presentation or says something critical about your studies, try not to take it personally. I think most of the time some criticism is good. It helps us improve kind of the quality of our work. And if all else fails, that's really more usually their issue than your issue, so try not to take it personally. Look at it as a good opportunity to grow. Also, individuals usually, it's not a bad idea to bring a resume or CV or business cards. I'd say most students don't carry business cards, so I wouldn't feel like you need to run out and get them, but it's not a bad idea to bring a resume or CV, but I think it really depends on why you're attending the conference. If you're really looking to connect and meet mentors or something like that, or there's sometimes some conferences that have, that are well attended by students will have panels or workshops on applying to grad programs, or they might have different grad programs talk about their, so then it makes a little more sense to bring materials, that in case you're going to be meeting somebody, I think that would be a more appropriate context. But, you can bring all those items with you regardless as well, but it certainly isn't a requirement. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention was professional attire. So what to wear to a conference. You want to make sure that you dress well and professionally, because dress does play a role in first impressions. Unfortunately, kind of some degree of how you look physically does play a role, especially if you're getting up and talking in front of people. So usually for conference attire, business casual is fine, so that's kind of what's depicted here. It is better to overdress than underdress, but just because you hear conference, don't assume that you have to necessarily wear a suit. I would say most of at least conferences I go to, people more wear kind of business casual, so something that kind of looks like this as opposed to, a suit. But, that's just based on my own experience. If you're ever not sure, ask somebody that's gone before, or that's kind of why it's also nice to get an opportunity to go when you're not presenting, just so you can kind of check it out or get a feel Make sure that you wear comfortable shoes though, because while you might not be walking a lot actually in the hotel, which is where usually conferences take place, conferences they usually have stuff planned all day, so it's a long day. Sometimes you might have to walk to your hotel if you're not staying at the conference hotel. So it's just a good idea to prioritize comfort, I think, over fashion. And bring a jacket or sweater, because much like classrooms and other kind of large buildings, they often tend to be cooler. And you don't want to be uncomfortable the whole time. So that's all I've got. I'll take questions. This is just information, again, about our student research and travel grants. Like I said, if you're presenting, you can get up to $1,000 to support your travel. Typically, support for conference registration is available if you're only attending a conference. You must apply prior to the travel date. So make sure that you remember that. We have 2 more deadlines left for the year, but we have monthly deadlines. This is the first year that we've had it, and it seemed to have worked well. Our deadlines were the 20th of every month, so I imagine it'll be something similar next year. But we certainly love to support students going out and doing these things. And if nothing else, it's a great opportunity for you to get on a plane and go somewhere and explore a new part of the country. Of course, you should attend the conference as well, but it's also a nice opportunity to get some money to help fund a trip somewhere. So, any questions about anything? Yeah.
Is it research based on only certain majors, or do they have a lot of more broad majors?
Yeah, no, I would say within every discipline there's some kind of conference usually, and usually there's conferences within that major or discipline, and then also within different applied fields. So for example, I can go to a psychology research conference, or I can go to a conference just for therapists, or I can go to a conference just on mental health that's attended by social workers and nurses and things, or you could go to a student conference. So there's lots of different types. So I would check with one of your faculty members that you are familiar with, or a lot of the departments have some of this information on their, it's not a bad idea, on their website. But if nothing else, there's of course our student conference here that would be of course good to check out and participate in. But yeah, within every field, there's usually some kind of meeting or a conference or something of that sort. Yeah.
Where can I find the PowerPoint?
I'm going to email the PowerPoint along with the last 2 PowerPoints to Dr. Marshall today. I promise. I'm going to text myself right when I'm done so I don't forget. And I think he'll post it for you guys.
And also, if this rush, does this have something to do with the Honors 104C?
Well, yeah, kind of, right? Because Honors 104C is really preparing you to speak in public, to give presentations.
I meant the Honors 104C project that's through my name.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So this might be a bit broad, but how do you get from a general area of interest to a particular topic to do research on?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think just by, getting your feet wet, really. So I think it depends. For example, what's your major?
Computer science.
Computer science, okay. So yeah, I think it's really hard sometimes to narrow and really figure out, kind of what you want to do or what you want to study within a particular discipline. I think that's partly why majors have you take electives and courses from different aspects of that field so that you could get exposed. So I don't know what that looks like in computer science, but in psych there's neuroscience, there's cognitive psychology, there's behavioral and learning, and then there's clinical, right? So by taking these classes, you kind of get exposed to all these little different areas, and then from there, you kind of narrow, and then you narrow, and then you narrow. So I would encourage you, to not put too much pressure on yourself to figure it out right now. I don't think that, I really knew exactly even, I think by closer to when I was like a senior, I think I kind of figured it out, but it obviously became even more and more focused the further I went on in my career. So even when I went to get and got into a PhD program, I knew I wanted to study trauma and interpersonal violence, but I didn't really know specifically what variant of that. But you can get very focused. So you don't put too much pressure on yourself to figure it out right now. I'd say take your classes, and then when all else fails, like see the faculty that you connect with or that you meet, and if nothing else, even if it's not a perfect match, it's just good to get that experience. So even if you don't know, don't let that stop you from getting involved, I guess, in research or some kind of creative activity, because you don't have to have it all figured out. But having that experience is going to help you make those decisions, as well as it's still going to build your skill set and resume. So whether or not I had done research as an undergrad in a biopsych lab, it still would have helped me even if I ultimately decided to become a clinical psychologist, for example. I think also just, if there's relevant jobs and things, like, for example, like in psych, like I worked a lot with kids, and that, helped me decide whether or not I wanted to keep doing that. So, I think just taking advantage of any kind of opportunity, whether it seems like it's something you like or not, because sometimes you don't really know until you get some exposure. But I would say go for opportunities. It's nice if there's a little bit of, as anxiety-provoking as it is, there is some benefit to not having it all kind of nailed out, because you can just try things. The world is your oyster. As you narrow, less and less things kind of become relevant. So there is a silver lining to not having it all figured out yet. But, yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions? All right, well, have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time. And let me know if you have any questions.